In the 2 years that I have been associated with Ferris Hill Baptist Church, this is the first time I can remember the pastor being off for a Sunday because of vacation. It's usually work or something that he associates along with work. So, he was in Haiti a couple times since I've been here. He went to Orlando for the Southern Baptist Convention. But even then, he didn't go inside the convention. He stood out on the boulevard and handed out bottles of water to people and told them that Jesus loved them. He also officiated at a wedding, I think, one time. So this is the first time I remember he took a vacation. So we should be very thankful that we have a pastor that's very driven and as focused as he is. But I love to preach, but sometimes I kind of feel like Cal Ripken's backup. I'm just kind of just waiting and waiting, but I appreciate the opportunity. But it's rare to find a pastor with that kind of focus and drive. But because he doesn't take a lot of vacation, and because he's not gone all that often, he's very, very inexperienced at how to find a good replacement for him. So he called, when he knew he was going to be out today, he called the smartest guy in all of Milton. He was unavailable. So then he called, he's like, well, if I can't get the smartest guy in all of Milton, I'm going to get the funniest guy in all of Milton. He was unavailable. He goes, well, if I can't get the smartest and the funniest, I'm going to get the best-looking guy in all of Milton. And I just had a hard time saying no 3 different times. So I said I would do it. And one thing about me is I like to wander around when I preach. If it starts getting bad, I'm out that door. So, but let's get right into it. February 9th, 1981, Marilyn gave birth to a bouncing baby boy. She and her husband Frank named the boy John after John Lennon and after the judge John Marshall. John was born in Washington, D.C. and spent the first 10 years of his life in Silver Springs, Maryland, where he lived out a quiet, peaceful, typical suburbanite life. Marilyn was a stay-at-home mom. Frank rode the bus every day to and from his job at the Department of Justice. Frank and Marilyn played with their 3 children, and they also attended Mass at St. Bernadette Catholic Church. Childhood friends of John's say that they happily recall playing football, basketball, riding bikes together, and just generally being loud like good boys are. Right? Boys are loud. At the age of 10, the family moved to San Anselmo, California, a city in the rich, socially liberal Marin County, which was near San Francisco. John played the flute and chose to keep a few close personal friends rather than maintain a large group of acquaintances. He often told people that he would love to help the poor when he gets older. After one semester at the local high school, he transferred to an alternative school that had about 100 students, was self-directed, and allowed the students to choose their own course of study. As a freshman and sophomore, John studied Middle East culture, including Islam. Around that time, Marilyn had left the Catholic Church and became a Buddhist. A family friend said she opened all those doors for her kids instead of dragging her kids into Catholicism like she had been dragged into. At that time, John was taking interest in religion as well. The autobiography Malcolm X inspired John to convert to Islam. His father was accepting immediately, whereas his mother had a little bit of reservations, but not a whole lot. Without a driver's license and still attending school, John was unable to attend the 5 prayer services offered at the nearest mosque, but on Fridays, he did change out of his Western clothes and attended the service with a friend, Abdullah Nana. Nana recalled that John stood out immediately from the rest of the mosque, not because he was white in a mostly Indian mosque, it was because he was so immediately devoted and extremely devoted to Islam and the Quran. The two spent the 20-minute rides to and from the service passionately discussing the Quran. Now, remember the last time you took a 20-minute ride to your church and back passionately discussing the Bible. In 1998, John passed the California equivalency test and received his high school diploma. He had asked that the name on his certificate be changed to his Muslim name, but he never picked up his diploma. Soon after the passing of the test, John found an Arabic-teaching language school in Yemen that taught a version of Arabic more closely related to that which is in the original language of the Quran. With the goal of reading the Quran in the original language and also worshiping Islam in a Muslim country, John moved to the Middle East at the age of 17. From the age of 16 to 18, young John transformed from a smooth-cheeked American boy to a bearded student of Islam in Yemen. Were the parents on board? His father, Frank, said yes. He was always intellectually coherent and had a good sense of humor. None of that changed since his conversion to Islam. I never had any misgivings. John returned to California for Christmas in 1999 and found that his parents had divorced and that his father was now living in San Francisco with a homosexual lover. John discussed with Nana how his trip to Yemen had not met his expectations because they were not as orthodox or strict on Islam as he had hoped. On October of 2000, the USS Cole was bombed. Frank sent his son an email telling him how bad he had felt for the families that lost loved ones. John's reply was that the Cole was attacked because it was stationed in a Muslim country's harbor and was therefore acting aggressively. Frank dismissed the father Ed as a father-son debate similar to the ones him and his father had about Vietnam War years before. In November, John left Yemen to study at a madrasa, or an Islamic school, in Pakistan. It was there that he met many people associated with the Taliban and began reading their literature, fell in love with their ideas, and soon was sent to an al-Qaeda training camp where he learned to shoot a Kalashnikov and met Osama bin Laden several times. By the way, he said he was unimpressed by him. By now, you are probably aware that I have been speaking about John Walker Lind. Anybody familiar with that name? The American Taliban. John Walker Lind, also known as the American Taliban, was captured by the Afghan Northern Alliance on November 25, 2001, where he pretended to be an Irishman. There was a prison uprising that ended with America's first casualty. It was CIA agent Johnny Mike Spann. The prisoners seeking refuge escaped to the basement of the prison where they awaited a standoff. The next day, the Red Cross sent in workers to treat the wounded prisoners, but the prisoners murdered them. On December 2nd, the Northern Alliance diverted an irrigation trench and began to flood out the starving prisoners. Some drowned. Lind surrendered. It was at this point that we got to see our first glimpse of the American Taliban, and millions of us in America, at least I did, I don't know about the rest of y'all, but millions of Americans asked ourselves the same question: what is he doing there? When I saw that picture, I was like, that is a white dude. He's got a big beard. He's in the Taliban. This was a few months after 9/11. I was like, what in the world is he doing there? Now, have you ever asked yourself that same question? What am I doing here? Have you ever been in a situation where you're like, what in the world am I doing here? How did I get into this mess? It may not be, looking around the room, I don't see too many people that look like they've been training in an Afghanistan Taliban training camp. But we all have been in situations where we are in a bad way, stuck, like, I'm in trouble, I don't know how I'm going to get out of this thing. But maybe you found yourself in the principal's office, or maybe the police station, and you're wondering, how am I going to get out of this mess I'm in? Maybe it was you and your boyfriend praying over a pregnancy results test, and praying and vowing, I'll never do this again if this will come out for me. Maybe your friends talked you into shoplifting and you got caught, and you're wondering, how in the world how did I get from walking to school to sitting in the manager's office at this store? Or maybe you found yourself in the midst of an affair and you're like, what steps did I take that led me to this? I was happily married and now how did I get in this situation? How did I get here? What's interesting about most of the difficult situations we run into, not all of them, is that they usually stem from decisions that we have made. Just like the story with Johnny Walker Lind. And by the way, you can tell Pastor Brian that I preached about Johnny Walker, but just don't tell him I preached on Johnny Walker, because that might cause my termination. I might slur my speech a little bit. That's because my mouth is all dried up. But John Walker Lind's life journey, he made several decisions along the way. And his parents also helped him make several decisions along the way. His parents made the decision to allow him to choose whatever religious path that he would like to choose on. And as a young boy, he decided that he would like to step away from Catholicism and join into Islam. That decision that led him to Islam also led him to radical Islam, which led him to wanting to study radical Islam in the Middle East, which led him to reading Taliban literature, which led him to being in Afghanistan al-Qaeda training camp, which led him to Osama bin Laden, which led him to learning how to shoot a Kalashnikov, which led him into being arrested, which led him into having a standoff against the United States government. An American citizen in a standoff against the United States government is treason. How did that young boy go from that to what we have here pictured there? How did he get there? Today we're going to look at a passage from the Bible studying one of the all-time greatest men in the biblical history, and we're going to see how he handled a bad situation. We'll see that he made a right decision for the wrong reasons, and continued down a path that could only lead to his demise. We'll see how his lack of faith triggered these decisions and how faith ultimately saved him. We're going to be talking about David. We all know the story. of the young shepherd boy named David who killed Goliath. He was a young shepherd boy, and his dad sent him to go bring some food off to his brothers who were fighting in the war, and he gets to the war, and there's nothing really going on. All there is this giant comes out every day and taunts them, and the Israeli soldiers are just standing there like afraid of him. So he's like, what's going on here? So he takes a sling, 5 stones, and goes out and says, I'm going to kill him in the name of God. And so he hits him in the head with the stone. He falls over, and as soon as he falls over, he runs up and grabs his Goliath's sword and chops off his head. Now, after that story, Saul was so impressed with them that he brought him into his kingdom, his castle, wherever his headquarters were, and he became one of his little assistants or staff members. He also would play the harp for Saul whenever he got upset. And David was also, he eventually married Saul's daughter, Michal, and became the king's son-in-law. He was also the king's bodyguard, the commander of his bodyguard. So he was a pretty big dude. But Saul began a long descent where he lost most of his ability to rationalize anything due to a distressing spirit from the Lord. In fact, the only thing that could calm Saul down was to have David play the harp for him. Unfortunately, Saul's resentment and jealousy over David grew so much and escalated to the point where Saul tried to kill David. And he would sit there and be playing the harp, and Saul would get so mad he would take a spear and just try to pin him to the wall with his spear. Unfortunately, David never got the point. David and Saul's son Jonathan were best friends. Saul began working on a plot to kill David, so Jonathan warned his friend. The two worked out a plan where David would miss the monthly feast. They call it the new moon feast, and David would miss it. And the plan was, when Saul noticed that David was missing, he would say, "Where's David?" And John would say, "Well, he asked permission to go worship with his family back home." And then if Saul acted crazily and blew up and got real mad, then they knew that David's life was in danger. If Saul acted understandably, they knew that David's life was not in danger. So the plan was that after 3 days, after that little test, Jonathan would go out to the field where David was hiding, and then Jonathan would shoot 3 arrows and send his servant boy out to go get the arrows to collect them. And if David was safe, he would say, "I think the arrows are on this side of you." If he was in danger, he would say, "I think the arrows are way past you, or on the other side of you." And then after that, they would know David would know what to do. Well, the next day they had that feast, and David was missing, and Saul had a fit. He was very angry, and so Jonathan knew that his life was in jeopardy, and so Jonathan, instead of waiting the 3 days, went out the next day, and he shot those 3 arrows, and then the servant boy went after him, and Jonathan said, "I think they're way past there. They're way out there. Keep going. Don't slow down. Speed up. Pick up your feet. Come on. Move your legs. Go, go, go," which was a little more emphatic of the original signal, which was like, "I think they're beyond you." He was telling him, your life is in very much danger. And so I think David got the idea. But the servant boy, you ever thought about what the servant boy was thinking? "Get off my back, dude. Go get your own arrows." He's like, "I'm going as fast as I can," because the servant boy had no idea what he was doing. He just was getting arrows, and Jonathan was picking on him. So he went to go get the arrows, and he brought them back to Jonathan, and Jonathan said, "Why don't you go on into the city?" And after that, then David and Jonathan met, and they said their goodbyes, and they said, "Dude, your life is in danger. We got to get going." So that's kind of where we pick up. Both knew that David's life, through no fault of his own, and through he was a perfect citizen, a perfect servant of the king, but David's life was in danger. And so that's where we're going to pick up. In 1 Samuel 21, verses 1 through 15. I'm going to be reading from the New King James Version. This is now David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid when he met David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one was with you?" So David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has ordered me on some business and said to me, 'Do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you or what I have commanded you, and I have directed my young men to give to such and such place. Now therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever can be found.' And the priest answered David and said, 'There is no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread, if the young men have at least kept themselves from women.' Then David answered the priest and said to him, 'Truly women have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out, and the vessels of the young men are holy, and the bread is in effect common, even though it was consecrated in the vessel this day.' So the priest gave him holy bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread, which had been taken from before the Lord, in order to put hot bread in its place in the day when it was taken away. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there in that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of the herdsmen who belonged to Saul. And David said to Ahimelech, Is there not here on hand a spear or a sword? For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. So the priest said, The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, there it is, wrapped in a cloth behind that ephod. If you will take it, for there is no other except that one here. And David said, There is none like it, give it to me. Then David arose and fled that day from before Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? Now David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them, pretended madness in their hands, scratched on the doors of the gate, and let his saliva fall down on his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, Look, you see the man is insane. Why have you brought him to me? Have I need of a madman that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? That's where we're going to stop. Let's bow our heads and pray. Father, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your eyes. Amen. When I told my dad what I was going to be preaching on, the title of my sermon, his name is David, by the way, he said, I don't think I'm going to show up. Well, Drooling Davids. But up to this point, everything we know about David has been positive. He was a hard-working shepherd who protected his sheep from bears and from lions and from wolves and everything else that would harm them. He was the only one that trusted God enough to attack the Philistine giant by himself. Even though all the armies had a sword, he had a slingshot and a rock. He was a war hero. He was a valuable part of the king's household. He played the harp to soothe the king's soul. He was secretly anointed to be the next king of Israel. He was the commander of the king's bodyguard. He was a great friend who could be trusted completely. Now, very clearly, David is getting treated unfairly, and quite justifiably is probably asking, why? How did I get in this situation that I'm at? When we leave chapter 20 with David saying goodbye to Jonathan, and we enter chapter 21 with David at Nob. Before there was a tabernacle, or before there was a temple, there was a tabernacle. And the tabernacle was like a gigantic tent. If you picture a big square circus tent, the tabernacle functioned exactly as the temple would function later, but it was basically just a big tent that they could pick up and carry. That's what they worshiped God at when they were on their exodus out of Egypt, and they spent the 40 years. They just picked up their tent and went wherever they were going to go. But God could choose where he wanted his temple, his tabernacle to be set up at. And at that particular time, the tabernacle was set up at Nob. Nob was about 2.5 miles north of Jerusalem and about 5 miles south of Gibeah, where King Saul had set up his kingdom's headquarters, and it also happened to be where David was hiding out at during that whole time of the camp. Chapter 21, verse 1 says, Now David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest. That is very specific. It doesn't say, now David wandered around and ended up in Nob, and then while he was wandering around the city, bumped into this guy named Ahimelech the priest. It said David came to Nob, and he came to Ahimelech the priest. Now, your first reaction might be, this godly man, a man after God's own heart, is in trouble and is reaching out and trying to find shelter in the house of the Lord. That might be a good idea, but let's see how. Let's dig deeper and see how the story unfolds. Ahimelech, the priest, was afraid when he met David. Some translations say he trembled. Why? David was a pretty big deal. He was a social hero, a social and political celebrity. He was a war hero, king's son-in-law. He was the king of the commander of the king's bodyguard. He was a big deal. He also had been camping for the last few days. How many of y'all ever been camping? I'm not talking about camper camping. I'm talking sleeping bag on the ground camping. You wake up and you got dirt all over your face. You're like, how did this happen? Did I rub my face against a tree at night? It's like what happens is you pick up logs, you whatever it is, your hands get dirty, you don't know, and you just start scratching your face and you get dirt all over the place. Now, picture David. He's been on the road for about 3 days now. He's got dirt all over his face, dirt all over his hands. His hair is crazy, smells terrible. looks terrible. It's probably been crying, maybe been very upset over the last several days, obviously. Hasn't eaten anything, and then he just kind of shows up. Now, picture those cute Obama daughters. I wish I would have learned their names before I came up here, but imagine one of them showing up at the place where you worked, and they looking and smelling exactly like David probably looked and smelled. How anxious and nervous would you be if they showed up like, what are you doing here? Like, I'd be a little bit nervous. I'd be a little bit anxious. So Ahimelech was like, what you doing here? And Ahimelech asked David, why are you alone? David responds with, the king has ordered me on some business and said to me, do not let anyone know about the business in which I send you or what I have commanded you, and I have directed my young men to such and such place. Okay, so the king sent David on a mission, urgent mission, and told him not to bathe, comb your hair, or bring anything with you. Kind of weird. So, question number 1, did King Saul order David on official business? No. Question number 2, doesn't it seem like David made up the whole part about not telling anyone about the king's business to kind of keep the priest from asking more questions? Yes. Question number 3, how many men did David have with him? 0. So here we have this man after God's own heart who, when faced with adversity, ran to the place where the glory of God dwells, the tabernacle, lied at least 3 times to a priest. Now, I don't know about you, but I was always raised not to lie, but definitely do not lie in church, right? If you lie in church, it's like lightning. That's why the church's roofs had to be done over and over again, because people lie in church, they keep getting zapped, you know. You don't lie in church. Now, David lied. What's worse than lying in a church is lying to a priest, right? Don't lie, but if you're going to lie, definitely do not lie to a priest or a preacher or a rabbi. You know, you just don't do it. And here we have David lying in church to a priest in the tabernacle. How many feet away from the Ark of the Covenant? It's crazy. But we can thus safely assume that he is not there for spiritual reasons. Let's see what he is there for. Verse 3, now therefore, what have you on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or whatever you have. I also have been raised to say please and thank you, and I don't make demands when I'm asking a favor from somebody. Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you have in my hand. David is there for food. He's hungry, understandably so. He kind of left in a hurry. The priest answered him and said that there is no common bread available, only the holy bread. The holy bread was 12 loaves of bread, 2 rows of 6 loaves of bread that represented the 12 tribes of Israel. And every week they would go in there and take those old bread away, and then they would replace it with new bread. This was holy bread. It was to remain in the presence of God. And the whole idea was that fresh loaves would be placed in there, old loaves would be taken out, kind of like our faith and our relationship with God. We want to keep our relationship with God fresh and never let it go stale. We want to always be in the presence of God with a fresh relationship and never let that relationship go stale. But that bread, that holy bread that was taken out after 1 week, it could be eaten by the priests and the priest only. It was holy bread. It wasn't to be eaten by anybody else. In this particular circumstance, the priest decided that it would be better to feed the bread to starving men than to maintain the Levitical law. Years later, Jesus would agree about that. And the priest offered the bread to David under one condition, that he and his men have abstained from sexuality with women since they've been on their journey. Again, how many people was David on the journey with? 1, himself. And he said, oh, no problem. Me and my men have abstained from sex since we've been on this journey. So, I don't have a problem with the priest offering up the holy bread to David. I don't have a problem with David taking the holy bread. I do have a problem with David taking the holy bread under false pretenses and circumstances. It'd be like somebody coming to the food pantry and saying, hey, I need a sack lunch for me and my 10 kids I have out in the car. And then you find out later that they don't have 10 kids. It's just them, and they just want 10 sandwiches or 11 sandwiches. But verse 8 gives us the second reason why David came to the tabernacle. He needed a weapon. How did he know that there would be a sword there? He put it there. After he killed Goliath, he took that sword, and I imagine he was propped up on on people's shoulders, and he had that sword, the victory. This little boy took a stone and killed the giant. God reached out and provided answers to his questions because of his faith. He was living a spiritual mountaintop journey experience, and he got to that tabernacle, and he put that sword there so he could rest in the tabernacle of God where the glory of God dwells. And so it stayed there. Much like if we have a piece of history or a priceless work of art, we take it and we put it in the Smithsonian so everybody can enjoy it. It's too great for one person to maintain for themselves. And so that's what he did. But the irony is, the last time that he touched that sword, he was on a spiritual high. This time, he's running, he's telling lies and half-truths in the presence of God, and he's getting everything he wants under false pretenses. And he's grabbed that sword and he's taken it. How much better would it have been if David would have taken that sling, a couple stones, and would have stood his ground in firm faith that God would provide for him, even because he didn't do anything wrong, that God was going to stand up for him. Now, just as it is important to know what David did at the tabernacle, it is important to know what David did not do at the tabernacle. He did not pray. He did not offer sacrifices. He did not seek help. He did not seek refuge. He did not seek protection. He didn't ask for them to pray for them. He didn't do any of those things. All he did was got what he wanted and left. Now, where did he go from there? He went from Nob to Gath. If you want to watch that little pinpoint jump over there, Gath is way over there. He went over there. You might have heard of Gath. Some of y'all are like, I remember that name. Gath is a familiar place because at that particular time it was a Philistine stronghold. It was one of their biggest cities. It also was the hometown of the most famous Philistine of all time, their hero, their champion, Goliath. Kind of a weird place for David to go. One of the reasons Saul resented David so much is because he wanted to be seen as the war hero that David was seen as. We have David, he's got songs sung about him that women would dance to. Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And the song was so catchy that even the Philistines heard about it, and they recognized it. But that song literally drove Saul nuts. He went crazy because of that song. But it also angered the Philistines. But you got to remember that every song that is a victory song for one side is a song of defeat for the other side. Every time they're like, yeah, remember David, he's awesome because he killed all those bad guys. And then the Philistines were like, I hate David because he killed all of our women, men, children, burned down our buildings, and killed our friends and family. Like, one side David was revered and loved, and the other side David was hated. And that song was like the only